Oh, thank you, Jamie. I'm so happy to be here, mainly because I've had a really crappy week. Just going to be honest. Has anyone else had a crap week? Just me? I'm cool with that. I really felt like I was failing at life this week, just very briefly, because total first world problems. I did this brutal double shift, which obviously is no big deal, and I used to do that all the time, but it absolutely slammed me. My 1-year-old got hand, foot and mouth, which is just foul, like you can't live through that. And then what happened? I had a confrontation with someone at work, which never happens, and I'm still sort of not sure how I've dealt with it properly. Then I went home and had an argument with my husband about who was more tired, which you cannot win that argument, right? You cannot come out of that. But look, this morning as I was having my 17th Nespresso and steeling myself to apologise to my husband, my little 1-year-old was running around the kitchen laughing, and I thought, yeah, maybe I haven't failed so much. And then, I came here and I've already met some really interesting and beautiful people and feel like I'm forming some new friendships. So if I had to describe it in one word right now, I'm very grateful to be here. So that's just a little insight into real Amelia, and now I'll start my newsreader Amelia speech. A family searching for their missing 16-year-old son has found his bloodied and battered body inside a house in Sydney's west. I promise it gets more cheerful. A grandmother has been found dead inside her home, believed to be another victim of the epidemic of domestic violence. An Australian teenager has been killed fighting for Islamic State in the Middle East. Welcome to the evening news lineup, a pretty standard representation of what we see on our screens every single night. So you've had a long day at work and you're cooking dinner, maybe you're helping the kids with homework, one eye on the telly, watching all of these stories. How do you feel about our world now? Not too cheerful, I imagine. As Jamie said, I've spent 12 years covering various local and international stories, and I currently present our afternoon news, bringing you a selection of stories just like the lovely ones I've just listed. So when faced with finding hope in the media, you can really understand why a lot of people roll their eyes and switch off. And actually, I've got lots of friends who tell me they do that on days when the news is particularly tragic, which is why it is so important that we do find and portray hope in news reporting. And it's all of our jobs, not just the journalists, but also cameramen, editors, producers, presenters, to report the facts, but to do it in a way that shows respect to the people involved in the stories, to represent all sides and all angles of the story, to not dramatise or sensationalise. And we have to do all that in this intense pressure cooker, which is a newsroom, a commercial newsroom in my case. Deadlines, hours of live bulletins, news directors who want the best, most promotable pictures, and they want them fast and they want them first. It is a really tough balance, and it's one that I've certainly struggled with over the years. In April 2008, 16-year-old Peter Edmonds was fatally attacked by a shark. He'd been bodyboarding off Ballina with a mate in northern New South Wales. His friend tried to drag him onto the sand and save his life, but he bled out and died. I was a young reporter on the Gold Coast, and I rushed to the scene and then to the family home where my cameraman and I saw the police leave. They had just told Peter's parents and his sister that he wouldn't be coming home. Now, my job, as confronting and perhaps vulgar as it might sound to many of you, was to door knock that family and get an interview. There was no other media there yet, so we'd beaten everyone to the chase, as it's called, which is considered a win. And I felt sick. I was desperately hoping, to be honest, that they just would tell us to go away or they wouldn't answer the door, so I could get out of there and tell my boss the family wasn't talking. But when I did knock, Pete's mum, Lisa, answered, and she was in a dressing gown and she had red swollen eyes, and she said, "He's such a good kid, he's such a lovely boy," still talking in the present tense, and she invited us in. So we had this long interview with Peter's parents and his sister, and they're such lovely people. But every now and then the mum would break into these heaving, sort of raw, really like almost gagging sobs. It just hadn't sunk in. They were still so numb, and I kept thinking, I should not be here. But they said they wanted to tell me, and through me, everyone, about their boy who was so loving and generous and had such a great sense of humour. And the Edmonds also had a really strong faith in God, and they knew that that, along with their memories, would get them through. And even, in those really raw, dark moments, they had that hope. And it was my responsibility, my job, to convey that. So I filled my script with their loving memories and their descriptions, and I included, the line about their strong faith, and I was praised for that exclusive, but also criticised. How could I approach a family in that situation? Vultures, as we are so often called. And I can still remember calling a colleague at 2 o'clock that morning. I couldn't sleep. I was, struggling with the situation and what I'd done. Anyway, they invited me to the funeral. They sent me a letter thanking me for the way I handled the story, and we've actually exchanged cards over the years on the anniversary of Peter's death. It's funny, for some reason, that story sort of stayed with me and affected me more than some natural disasters and big tragedies that I've covered. Just before Christmas of 2010, you might remember, a boat sank off Christmas Island. There were 90 asylum seekers on board. 48 of them drowned, 42 were pulled from the water. And I can remember standing on the rocks, watching bits of debris wash up and clothes, kids' clothes, in some cases shoes. And the people that did make it to the rocks scrambled up, screaming for all of those loved ones that they had left in the water. One Syrian man told me the next day through the bars of the detention centre that he'd lost his wife and 6 children, all of them drowned. And they'd come here hoping for a better life, and now he had nothing and no one. It's pretty hard to find hope in that story, I have to say. But wherever there are survivors, there is hope. And there was also a positive story in what happened on the island that day in terms of the residents who raised the alarm, first of all, and then they really put their lives on the line to help and save a lot of those people. They watched that boat be smashed into splinters, they watched children drown, and they did save a lot of lives, and many of them told me that it completely changed their view on asylum seekers. And I can tell you it changed mine. And it also sparked a fresh national conversation about asylum seeker policy. So there's no escaping the fact that a reporter's state of mind and emotional well-being does play a role in how we tell a story. And it's human nature, isn't it? If you're affected by a situation, if you're sad or you're angry or you're amused, it comes across in your language and it comes across in your tone, and your audience is going to pick up on that. What a powerful thing it is to be able to influence the telling of a story. But with that power comes such huge responsibility. When the deadly floods hit Queensland in 2011, the days of rolling coverage left us all exhausted and defeated. There were so many tales of personal tragedy, weren't there? 12 deaths, countless homes lost and families displaced. And look, reporting on these events is nothing compared to living through them, obviously, but everyone was tired and, it took its toll. There were seasoned presenters, as I recall, breaking down on air. Time to change the tone, to focus on the good. And suddenly you had all these incredible stories of resilience and survival and hope, human stories about ordinary Queenslanders just doing extraordinary things. There was a mum of 3 who put a shout out on Twitter for anyone who didn't have food. And then she baked and made sandwiches and delivered them all around Brisbane, and strangers joined her along the way. And who could forget those images of the mud army marching through the soggy streets of Brisbane with their shovels and their rakes and their big smiles. The sun came out and the voices on the streets perked up a notch, and so did the voices on our screens. A couple of weeks ago, I covered the funeral of Bali 9 drug smuggler Myuran Sukumaran. I've been to a lot of funerals for work, sadly. Car crash victims, the shark attack victim I mentioned, child murder victims, famous people, ordinary people. This felt different, really different. He was a 34-year-old, a healthy 34-year-old man who'd been walked into this field in the dead of night and tied to a wooden pole and shot in the head. And he was a criminal. He was a convicted criminal, and his past actions as the ringleader of drug syndicates had impacted so many people. And he'd recruited other Australians whose lives also have been ruined to do an illegal job, and the job would have led to deaths, at the very least devastation of a lot of lives. And I, like a lot of journalists, and I think a lot of Australians, followed the case closely. I sat up on that night, April the 29th, watching the clock tick towards the inevitable moment that Sukumaran and his friend and fellow smuggler Andrew Chan would face the firing squad, and watch the rolling coverage. Now, whatever your political viewpoint or your moral stance is, the whole thing was absolutely horrifying, really. So, go forward a week to the funeral, and I was faced with a really different challenge in my reporting that day than I think I ever have been. I was surrounded by this raw grief and disbelief of his family and friends, and also a lot of strangers, people that, just had been touched by his plight. But I couldn't glorify him or his death, and I couldn't paint him as a hero because he wasn't. So in the end, I just played it straight and let the pictures tell the story, which they always should. And in a very dark and divisive news story, I really found a strong message of hope that I think needed to be told. And that was that in 10 years in jail, Sukumaran had turned his life around, and not just his life, he had impacted so many people in that prison. He started workshops and different initiatives, art classes, and he created an environment where there was hope and purpose. And his family, whilst they were so devastated, they were proud of him, and they hoped that he could be remembered not as the criminal that he went into prison as, but as the man that he became, And also, obviously it sparked a new global campaign to end the death penalty. I was 21 years old when I saw my first beheading. I was a young producer at Sky News. In 2004, an American, Nicholas Berg, was decapitated by Islamist militants. I watched the vision with full audio, and I had to turn that around to be the lead package for the top of the next hour. Obviously, we didn't show the beheading, as no Western media outlet would. And we have very strict policies at Nine about where we draw the line, what we show and what we don't show in terms of images that may be distressing. We don't show bodies, we don't show body bags, we don't ever show the moment of death, if you like. We blur faces, we protect identities, we protect information. And we run a lot of warnings, and that is because who knows what the impact of something we show, how that's going to impact on the emotional well-being of not only someone that might be involved in the story, but any number of our viewers. Which brings me to the reporting of suicide. Every week, newsrooms are aware of several, sometimes dozens of cases of suicide, and we do not report them. Why? Because police and mental health professionals and organisations advise us that to do so would be more harmful than helpful in their battle to decrease suicide rates. But there still has to be a conversation, doesn't there? So it is that the Charlotte Dawsons of our world, the famous faces who tragically take their own lives, allow us as the media and the public to have that conversation. We can interview mental health experts and professionals. We can try and understand how and why someone could be so desperate and how to prevent that. And we need to help the public understand that, while at the same time acknowledge that any number of our viewers could relate to that desperation. And in those cases, we must inspire hope, and we must prompt people to get help. And we always run that lifeline warning as well with the number for anyone that's watching. We also work very closely with police on a number of stories. During the Sydney siege in December, we knew far more than we chose to report. We knew the identity of the gunman, I think about 9 or 10 hours before we were asked by police to release it, which we then did. We had reporters working 24, 36 hours straight. We had hostages ringing our newsroom, making demands, sending us videos of themselves in which their lives were threatened. Obviously, we never put any of that to air. In those situations, we are a public service. An unprecedented terror attack was unfolding in the heart of Sydney, and the city really stopped. Everyone turned on their radios and their televisions, and they watched and they listened to every little development. And our cameras were trained on the faces of those hostages in the Lint Cafe window as they waited to hopefully live or die. And, hours later, when those shots ran out in the night, we were still live on air when those 2 hostages were killed. And I'm sure we all remember there really was a darkness over Sydney that day. People were crying in the streets. How could this happen? And then someone placed a single bunch of flowers very early in the morning during our Today Show coverage on Martin Place as a sign of a tribute to those who died and also the hostages who'd survived. That bunch of flowers became a pile and then a group and then this sort of carpet and then finally this amazing sea of vibrant colour and beauty, and the cards that were attached with words of peace and love and hope. We saw the flowers on television and we just wanted to come in from wherever and contribute, people told us. And they came from all over. And the families of Katrina Dawson and Tori Johnson came too. They hugged strangers, they read the cards, they took some flowers. Sydney really came together, and I think the media really helped it happen and spread those really important messages. We will not forget. We will ride with them. We will not live in fear. So these are a few examples of how we conduct ourselves in the field, and I also want to leave you with an important message, I feel, about how we conduct ourselves in our newsrooms. You might have gathered by now that newsrooms can be very tough places, fast-paced, they're intense, they're often incredibly competitive. There's a lot of yelling and a lot of bad language, but there's also a lot of laughter because, let's face it, how else would we process the things that we see and hear? So you do need a quick wit and a tough skin to survive, and you also need compassion and empathy and sensitivity and respect. And while newsrooms, I think, are a much better place for women than they used to be, it can be a very, very brutal place. And sometimes I'll find a young producer or reporter crying in the toilets about any number of issues. And I recently counselled one such producer. I'm going to read because this is a quote. What she said to me, she was having issues with someone else at work and she basically didn't feel her work was good enough, and this is what she said to me. I've never felt more worthless in my life. The worst bit is the lack of hope. I only need a bit of hope to keep going, but I've got none. A young, keen producer essentially under my care. I was devastated and I was very concerned about her well-being. So we talked it through, we made an action plan and we discussed options. It is all of our responsibility as leaders to look out for each other in the workplace, to perceive problems, to identify when people are struggling, to encourage and to mentor them, and to make sure that no one ever feels that way about themselves. Because I have cried in the toilets so many times over the last few years, I can't tell you. Copped a spray from the boss over a wrong decision or been beaten to the chase. I've been criticised and vilely criticised on social media, but I too have had others to support and to mentor me. That girl, by the way, huge turnaround. She's doing so much better. It's a positive story. Look, I think I've been pretty honest about how we deal with some situations, and I really think I work in the best newsroom in the country. Whilst we do have to deal with some pretty horrific situations, morale is high and we have a great support network and we do laugh a lot. And we find great joy in the good stories. The funny stories and the positive stories, entertainment, fashion, features, Prince Harry on tour, new tiger cubs born at Taronga Zoo. People say it's fluff, but it is news. It is the good and the interesting things that are happening in our world, and it puts a smile on people's faces and it balances out the bulletins. So I know I focused on the bad tragedies because those are the ones that people ask me about, and they are the toughest to report on, and they're definitely the most significant in terms of our responsibility as media, but they're not always the ones that dominate conversation. And last week, over dinner with friends, I mentioned a story that really affected me, which was the death of a 2-year-old boy in a house fire in Queensland. And before I could finish my sentence, one of my friends piped up and said, "I couldn't watch it. Please can we not talk about it?" Another friend said, "Just horrendous. I don't want to talk about it." And everyone was quiet. And then my other friend said, "So, what do you guys reckon is going to happen to Johnny Depp's dogs? Can we talk about that instead?" And so we did. Thank you very much.